So here are a few objectives of broadly what we'll cover through our session today. I'll ask you to refer back to these objectives when you fill out the evaluation. Shortly after the webinar, we do use that evaluation feedback to inform our work and report to our funders. So I really appreciate in advance that you can fill that out. Today is really about thinking about how we have meaningful and productive and respectful engagement with older adults across our communities. Older adults who live with inequities are especially difficult. They're not difficult. It's difficult to engage with them in a way that's respectful and meaningful, where they feel valued and they're making contributions that are have real impact. And it's difficult for them to feel like they're part of a system that's existing around them and operating without a whole lot of input. And so what we want to do is break down some of that difficulty that they feel and open up those channels so that they can engage in a really meaningful way. So periodically I'll ask you to, in the chat box, and anytime the ideas come to you, what are some really tangible and practical ways that we can engage with older adults across our communities so that they actually influence the decisions of public health, health promotion, health systems, community health, organizations. So it's not just tokenism, and so they can actually provide some meaningful influence for the direction of the services that are around them. We have three amazing speakers today. Peggy Edwards is one of the co-editors and contributors for the Promoting Health in Older Adults book. She's a health promotion consultant, policy analyst, and a writer who specializes in issues related to aging, social justice, volunteerism, and gender. She's worked with Health Canada, Canadian Public Health Association, World Health Organization, and she's the co-author of 3 best-selling books on healthy aging and grandparenting. She's part of the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign. She's part of a number of advocacy networks, and she's going to explain a bit more about that in her presentation. Dr. Arne Stinchcombe is an assistant professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa, and he's an investigator with the Briere Research Institute. He maintains expertise in the psychosocial aspects of aging, with a particular focus on equitable aging experiences for sexual and gender minorities. He holds a new investigator award from Alzheimer's Society of Canada that's focused on dementia and caregiving experiences of the 2S LGBTQ+ community. And he's also the psychology editor for the Canadian Journal on Aging. And Dr. Karen Kobayashi is the Associate Dean of Research and Grad Programs in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and a number of other titles, all out of the University of Victoria. She's a social gerontologist, and she really uses a life course perspective to explore how cultural, structural, individual factors intersect and influence the experience and health of the aging population. She's published widely in areas of family and intergenerational relationships, ethnicity, immigration, dementia, personhood, health, healthcare, and she will talk to us today about this significant challenges of older adults who are part of the immigrant community and the equity issues that they are dealing with on an everyday basis. And with that, I'm going to ask my friend Irv Rootman to say a few words to us about this series and about the book. Irv, I think you need to unmute, love. There you go.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Diane. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I live, walk, and speak on the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsalal, Watuth, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. On behalf of Health Promotion Canada, I welcome you to the third in this series of webinars based on the recently published book on promoting the health of older adults, the Canadian Experience. Health Promotion Canada is an organization and community of people from across Canada that aim to advance the practice of health promotion in Canada and have organized a number of webinars in partnership with the National Collaborating Center on the Determinants of Health over the past few years. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the editors, the contributors, Canadian Scholars Press, who were the publishers of the book. With regard to getting a copy of the book, I'm pleased to announce two things. First is that there will be a draw today for a free copy of the book, and Diane will pick the name from the list of participants here today. Second, if any of you are interested in purchasing the book, Canadian Scholars is offering a discount to all of you. You visit canadianscholars.ca and use the discount code on this slide for 20% off until April 23rd. We will put the code in the chat box as well. So 35 years ago, the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion was created and has served as a global framework for promoting health for all ages since that time. The book and this webinar series are organized around the 5 action strategies in the Charter to promote the health, well-being, and equity of older persons. And we're going to, in this webinar, we're concentrating on strengthening community action. So with that, I'll turn the floor back to our Diane to push us through.
Thanks, Irv. This has been a really wonderful partnership between NCCDH and Health Promotion Canada, and our second time through actually doing webinar series and doing projects together. And so I think we're expanding, and I think we're getting stronger, and it's, yeah, I'm really grateful for it. So thank you. Peggy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Right. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here. Very excited about this webinar. I would like to acknowledge that I'm from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I'd like to give a special recognition of the elders in this community, from whom I continue to learn so much. As Irv has said, today is about strengthening community action. This is how it was defined in the Ottawa Charter. The key words that we talk the most about, of course, are community engagement and action. So next slide, please. Okay, that's a different one than I had.
Oh, you know what, Peggy? I put this in, and I'm sorry for the interruption.
That's okay.
I found this really neat slide. I wanted a bit of a marker slide to sort of mark the beginning of the activism piece. And I found this wonderful article that talked about intergenerational activism and what that actually appears and looks like. And I thought this was just a really lovely photo. And the article was
and thank you for doing that, because that was one of the points I wanted to make, is that one of the myths, of course, is that older people and younger people have nothing in common and are, you know, the sort of the hello boomer thing and you know, against each other. But in fact, what we're seeing is more and more intergenerational activism, particularly around the climate issues. So yeah, good slide. We won't talk about all of some of the key words and concepts, you know those, but I do want to point out to the importance of the term intersectionality, which it started way back in the early feminist literature, but is commonly used today. And that's the reality that it's this intersectionality of factors, such as low income and racial minority, that may lead to double or triple the risk of health inequalities and inequities. And of course, we know that older Indigenous people also carry the scars of colonialism, residential schools, and other forms of discrimination. Next slide, please. The other myth I'd really like to counter is, you know, this thinking that older people are over the hill. And once you retire, you're not making contributions. When we know, in fact, that older people make enormous contributions to their families, to their communities, and to society in general. The next slide. Here's just some of the contributions very quickly that older people make You know, it's a myth that older people retire at 60. Nowadays, 1 in 5 persons over age 65 is working, including 1 in 4 amongst older immigrant adults. In terms of volunteering, older adults make a tremendous contribution. Over 40% of older adults in Canada are involved in volunteering. In terms of charitable giving, it's very interesting to know that in Canada, over age 75 is the age group most likely to give the highest donation to charitable work. And this doesn't even talk about the financial support that older persons offer to their families and to their children and their grandchildren. The other issue is caregiving. We always think that it's caregiving for older adults, but in fact, 1 in 8 older adults provides caregiving to another family member. So it goes both ways. And that doesn't even count the number of grandparents who support their grandchildren, not only financially, but as we have seen during the pandemic. In fact, it was often that grandparents became the teachers, became the educators when children were at home and had to do home learning. Political participation and voting, that's another myth that older people aren't involved in politics. That's actually counter to what the research, the evidence shows us. And in fact, older people, 65 plus, are the most likely age group to vote. And that is a really important factor. And, you know, politicians listen to that. They know that, that the older people in their constituency are going to be voting. In terms of advocacy with other groups, be it age-friendly groups, councils on aging, etc., important advocacy there. We mentioned intergender solidarity, but I'd like to end by looking at this concept of aging activism. The next slide. Okay, one of the groups I'm very involved with is called the Grandmothers Advocacy Network. It's a Canadian network, a dynamic network, volunteers from all across Canada that work to influence policy change and stimulate action in Canada and internationally at the UN level to promote and protect the human rights of grandmothers, children, and youth in sub-Saharan Africa. We know that there are some 17 million children, young people in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, who have been orphaned by AIDS. When I was working on a fellowship and looking at how older women are particularly involved in advocacy, and I looked at the Grandmothers Advocacy Network, I found that there were 2 kinds of older women involved. One group was what they would say to me, oh, it's in my DNA. I've been an advocate, you know, since I was a child all my life. But there was another large group who came to advocacy later in life. And I'd like to show you a brief interview with one of those women, Patricia Winston. And these interviews were done, thank you very much, from the Aging Activism Program at Trent University. So Diane, if you could just tune us into Pat.
My name is Pat Winston, and I was born in Vancouver and raised there, and now I live in Montreal.
What drew you into the work for social change?
Well, it's been a very slow process. I was born before the war, the Second World War, went through the war. Then I was talking to somebody this morning about it. Music played a tremendous role, I think, in life. And when I was young, the music was all sort of about love and romantic. I mean, there were lovely songs, but there was no protest. And I think when my era, we didn't protest too much. We sort of ran the gamut of doing what you were told, unless you were a certain type, which I guess I wasn't. I didn't start out, raging around. I didn't. I just accepted. I was a real acceptor. And I look back on that and I think that was terrible. But that's the way it was in my era, for sure. And looking back, my friends, we've often talked about it, and we feel the same way. But happily, of my friends that are still around, nobody else is as active, I have to say, as I am, and that because they're not as interested in politics, which I really am really interested in politics now. I guess the first time we were active, I lived my husband and family, we lived in a small town north of Toronto, and they decided to put a road through, and it was a lovely village of King City. Beautiful maple trees that met, it was gorgeous. Then they decided to put this road through. So obviously the trees had to come down. So we all got together, and that wasn't about to happen. We protested, we made banners, and we did all kinds of stuff. Of course, the trees came down and the road went through. So it was a bit of a failure. But so after that, I think by that time I was sort of in the typical role of having 3 kids and at home I wasn't working. But I think as time went on, we began to question things. It became a political thing. I'm a social democrat, so there were certain things to protest against that we felt were important. Health care was one of them, and I remember that very well when the health care first came. And we had a doctor in King City who was dead against it, and my husband and I were arguing about it, and because we could see it was very, very important to have this health care. And I think that's probably was the beginning.
You say you don't have many of these stories, but
Yeah.
there you go. You
Yeah.
get started.
Yeah, I guess so.
So I'd like to hear more about how your activism has changed at different parts of your life.
Yeah.
And how.
Well, it's certainly changed because I've gone from being very quiet to be raging. There are just issues now that you just cannot tolerate. And I have gone on many, many marches in the winter, in the summer, to Quebec City, to Ottawa many times. And I even got arrested once, which was the height of I'm very excited about that. And we were in Ottawa protesting the Keystone Pipeline. And they told us what would happen if we got arrested and how many days we'd have to stay in jail and all. It was a real big deal. And we had to climb over one of those barriers, they put up when parades are going to happen. So, of course, we were all a bit nervous. But the next day we went off to Parliament Hill and masses of people. And we went up in groups of 6, all held hands and went up. And the Mounties asked us if we were aware that we were going to be arrested. And we said, sure. And they said, are you fine with that? And we said, yes, we certainly are. And over we went. So we spent the day behind the barrier, and there were hundreds of people that climbed over that thing. And then eventually about 3 of us together, off we went with the Mounties, and they put those plastic things around and they put us in a paddy wagon and took us into the main part of Ottawa and opened the doors and let us out, and that was it. So we got a fine, and I had to sign a paper that I would not come into the Parliament buildings for a year.
Oh, wow.
So that was it.
So you're on their official record.
I'm on somebody's hit list, that's for sure. So I think now it has gone from being relatively passive to really being very angry and raging, I think. Not out of control, but you know what I mean. Yeah. There are so many issues from selling arms to Saudi Arabia to the injustice of, for instance, the pharmaceutical companies being so greedy with not wanting to have their generic medicines provided for developing and underdeveloped countries, especially for HIV/AIDS, which is still, even though it's not in the front page these days, it's still there, and many, many, many people are suffering from it. So that's where I sort of stand right at the moment, I think.
So as you continue to do this work, what do you find sustains you?
Oh, the people that I'm working with, absolutely. And things like this, the afternoon we've just had, definitely that. It's the kindred spirits that you're working with, and we feel together we can do something. Together you can really accomplish something. And I think probably we have, if it's only to make people aware of the issues. I know some of my friends think, oh, here she comes again, with one of these things. And I'm a bit of a political animal, I think so. But it does keep the people with whom you're working, keep you energized, and we can do it together, and I think we do. So we're not going to change the world, but we make a little hope sometimes. Yeah. What I'm involved in now, actually, two things. I belong to we call ourselves the West Hill Grandmother Group. We are part of the Grandmother to Grandmother campaign of the Stephen Lewis Foundation, and our main goal is fundraising, which we do a lot. So that's one thing, but now I'm very, very interested and involved in the Grandmothers Advocacy Network, because that's where you can really make a difference in probably nationally and locally and internationally as well. And our big push at the moment is education, particularly for girls who usually get put to the one side, and violence against women and girls. And the other one is the pharmaceuticals, medications to be made available. And of course that brings in the TPP. So we really protested many times about that. And in fact, we had two bills that were put forth by the New Democrats. And the first one was passed, and we went to Ottawa to see how the vote was going to go. And we were also excited and we were leaping around outside when they were asked us to leave, and the security were very upset with us because we were so excited because it had passed, and we thought, hooray, we couldn't believe it that it had actually happened. So we thought, well, now all it has to do is go through the Senate, and that was a piece of cake. Well, of course, the writ was dropped in the new election. They dragged it just long enough, and that was the end of that. We were heartbroken. So the next sitting, we tried again, and that one was a real fight because the previous government didn't want it, and that bill was not passed, and that was the end of it. Now I don't know what'll happen to it now, but GRAN is something I'm really interested in, because that means we can advocate in the broadest sense of the term, and that gives us strength, and there's strength in numbers. So that's really my main goal now is GRAN.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're most welcome. It was fun.
Yeah, I remember the day that the writ was dropped on the...
Okay, I think you can see how inspiring and fun it is to work, as Pat has said, together with older people on causes that we care about, and that older people can make a significant contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. That was really lovely. We'll share, perhaps my colleague Carolina has already shared the link to the video. Yes, I see that she has. And just so folks know too, there's lots of links that'll be popping up in the chat box, and we can share those with you in a follow-up email after the webinar. Lots of resources. And if you've got your own to share, then please do pop them in. Peggy, I was thinking about, before we go to Arne, I was thinking about the many conversations that we've had in planning this webinar and in planning this series. And I think I was saying to you the other day that, you know, when I grew up, so I grew up in a low income situation in a very small rural Nova Scotia town. And, you know, in my young mind, you know, activism or advocacy wasn't really an option for me or for my family. I was so focused on, you know, how my family was going to deal with whatever was happening, or, you know, how really getting through life. And so I think, you know, I think sometimes, I mean, I love this, and I think sometimes people just feel so disempowered that they can't do this, they can't do activism, or they can't do advocacy. And so then I think about how, as a system, can we encourage that, right? And how can we actually help build some of those skills, and how can we give greater voice to folks who don't feel like they have a voice or have the time and space in their lives to build that in. So I've been thinking lots of my mom through all of this. So thanks for that. And with that, Arne, I think I'm going to turn it to you.
Great, you can see my screen. And you can hear me, great. So thanks, Diane. And thank you for the thank you to the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health for really putting this together. I think it's fantastic. And Peggy, I loved what you had to say, and I especially loved Pat's story. Very inspiring. When I read through the book that Irv and Peggy and Fran and Melanie put together, this massive book, I couldn't help but feel that a common thread that links all of the subject areas together was the role of communities in supporting healthy aging. And I think a big part of supporting older people and communities has been, especially in Canada, the age-friendly communities movement. And I've been heartened to see the age-friendly communities movement in Canada grow over the years, and now starting to think about diversity within the age-friendly community movement. So today I'll be presenting some work that I've been engaged in over the last few years, focusing on one aspect of diversity within age-friendly, which is 2S LGBTQ older people. So that's folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit. And I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm based in Ottawa, and Ottawa is built on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. And I pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-researcher, Kim Wilson at the University of Guelph, as well as the fabulous research assistants who worked with us on this work, Emma Lipinski and Emma Whitehouse. This project was funded by Canada's New Horizons for Seniors program. And I'd also like to thank the community leaders and 2S LGBTQ2 people who participated in this work. So like I mentioned, age-friendly communities have gained a lot of traction in Canada and internationally, but also 2S LGBTQ2 people and Canadians haven't specifically been considered in these initiatives. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, has articulated 8 domains that make up age-friendly communities. And there's been some scholarship that's identified the importance of looking at the interplay between these 8 domains and intrapersonal factors, things like gender and sexual orientation. Some of my own work has shown that age friendliness is associated positively with quality of life for older adults, and yet little work has been done to explore and promote both age and 2S LGBTQ friendly communities in Canada. So when we think about aging 2S LGBTQ people, it's important to recognize that on the one hand, many of the members of these communities share similar experiences and concerns as their majority peers. So things like managing their health and their mobility needs, their caregiving and navigating healthcare. But on the other hand, they have distinct needs and challenges stemming from from their sexual and gender identities. So for example, 2S LGBTQ folks face generalized healthcare barriers, things like wait lists and costs and accessibility and proximity to services. And they might even face fears and experiences of prejudice and discrimination and have distrust with the healthcare system. So what do we know about members of these communities? Well, we know that 2S LGBTQ aging is informed by life course experiences that often involve minority stressors. So these are things like stigma and discrimination that I mentioned in the previous slide that are related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Our own work has shown that members of these communities are at greater risk for chronic disease and mental illness relative to their majority peers. As a community, we're less likely to be married and we're less likely to have children, which has some important implication for the receipt of care as well as the provision of care. And at the same time, we know that members of our community have rich social networks and a really strong sense and connection to community. I think the importance of the life course theoretical perspective, as well as minority stressors, are really nicely emphasized within the health equity promotion model. This is a model that was developed by Dr. Frederick Goldson specifically to articulate the aging experiences of members of these communities. And what I love about this framework is that it highlights, in addition to highlighting some of these disparities, it also highlights resilience and strength among members of these communities. It also emphasizes the structural and social and community levels, and these are all components of age-friendly communities, as well as their relationship to health among older 2S LGBTQ people. When we think about older 2S LGBTQ people, I think it's important to consider the historical context in which much of these folks have lived, right? So in 1969, Canada decriminalized homosexuality. And in 1973, homosexuality was no longer considered a mental disorder. Members of these communities were impacted by the HIV epidemic. And in 2005, same-sex partners were allowed to marry in Canada. And more recently, gender identity and expression were added to the Canadian Human Rights Act. So imagine how these socio-political changes occurring over the life course might shape your aging experience and your experience of community as well. So given that relationship that I described between age friendliness and quality of life, as well as the momentum that we're seeing around AFC in Canada, we set out to examine how existing age-friendly community initiatives ensure the inclusion of 2S LGBTQ people, older adults specifically, and how community can become both age and 2S LGBTQ friendly. For this study, we started off with an environmental scan. We reviewed age-friendly and 2S LGBTQ initiatives in Canada. And from there, we launched an electronic survey. There were 71 participants who completed the survey. Participants were asked to identify initiatives within their communities. And we also asked them what makes communities 2S LGBTQ age-friendly and what barriers and facilitators have you experienced. We then invited key informants who were identified as community leaders in our survey through our environmental scan to complete semi-structured key informant interviews. So we had 18 folks complete interviews. And we asked people, what's happening in your community to support members of these communities? And what are some of the successes and what are some of the challenges around making communities both age and LGBTQ2 friendly? So, as I mentioned, survey participants identified 77 organizations and programs from 26 communities across North America. And so these were pride organizations that offered programs for older adults. They were organizations for older people that offered 2S LGBTQ specific programs. They were organizations for any population with supports for 2S LGBTQ people. So the initiatives varied by their location, so urban versus rural, by their missions, and by the types of services that they offered. But interestingly, there were no designated age-friendly community initiatives that had been that were specifically linked to the WHO that had been identified. And just to say that we know that these 77 organizations don't at all capture all of the activities, but I think it's a pretty good snapshot of the types of activities that are taking place. So in the interviews, we discussed the needs and considerations for age and 2S LGBTQ friendly initiatives. And through our analysis, we identified 5 themes. So communities that are both age and 2S LGBTQ friendly are diverse, they're intergenerational, they're free from harassment and discrimination. They include programs, inclusive programs and services. There's this systemic inclusion and also the visibility of older 2S LGBTQ people. And these are communities that are encompassing and compassionate. And I'll just briefly read this quote, which from a key informant interview, which I found very profound. So there are things specific to our community that make a world of difference, particularly as we age and around healthcare, around being able to be open and honest with who you are. But it's unbelievably important that you have somebody that you can talk to and who wants to hear your stories. And that's just humanity, and that connects all of us. So participants described these types of communities as involving the entire life course. Age-friendly to me is cradle to grave. It's a community that's free from harassment and discrimination, so one where I'm not judged for my sexuality or my gender identity. It's a community that has inclusive programs where there are resources for you in healthcare and the community that are easily accessible, where you're treated as a person, nothing more and nothing less. It's a community that recognizes the diverse makeup of its residents and celebrates its all-inclusive default position. And it's an encompassing and compassionate community. So a community that acknowledges and embraces its elders will always be stronger for doing so. So this is just a snapshot of some of our findings, but through this work, we've really gained some insights into the current landscape of age and 2S LGBTQ friendly initiatives across North America. And learning from leaders and members of these communities, I think these insights can help inform current and future age-friendly initiatives, as well as inform recommendations to government and policymakers. Gaining an understanding of the successes as well as the challenges of current 2S LGBTQ friendly organizations can highlight what we can promote and what we can use as models for inclusive age-friendly initiatives, as well as where more attention needs to be focused and maybe where resources need to be allocated. It can also reduce some of the redundancy that we might see, so avoid kind of reinventing the wheel. And our findings also highlight the important role that organizations and champions within the community play in making a community more inclusive and more welcoming for diverse older adults. Perhaps this could be another facet that could be used to expand upon in future age-friendly initiatives. And together, these will contribute to improving quality of life and community inclusion and integration, as well as access to affirming supports and services for 2S LGBTQ older adults. I'll just briefly mention that I'm really excited to be able to give you a snapshot of some of our findings. And in the coming weeks, we'll be launching a report stemming from this work in French and in English. You'll be able to access it on our website. And in addition to our findings, we've also profiled many age-friendly and 2S LGBTQ initiatives that we've termed spotlight communities. So these are programs and services and organizations that communities have identified as being promising practices in this area. So there are things like dinner clubs and social groups and coffee clubs, choirs, that sort of thing. And also, we'll be launching a series of public-facing interviews with community leaders who discuss their local initiatives and some keys to their success. And so really briefly, you know, on the top left, we see Lisa Middleton. Lisa is the mayor of Palm Springs, and she has some really wonderful advice for municipalities on how to engage members of these communities. Thanks for your attention, and I'll look forward to some questions and discussion.
Thanks, Arne. I love sitting here and listening to the presentation. So I've seen the slides and we've had meetings, but I love today just being able to sit and listen to you talk it through. It means so much more to hear the explanation. And there was a couple of things you said that really resonated with me, and that focus on life course experiences. So, you know, we talk a lot about that with social determinants and equity. And, you know, it's for many years, I would refer to life cycle, you know, and in public health, and I'm a dietitian, you talk about life cycles, right? Stages of life, but this is life course. And really it means that experiences and environments and conditions at every point in life changes the trajectory of the life course. And so when you were talking about that and then around stigma and discrimination, and I was thinking about how stigma and discrimination experienced by folks at various points of the life course can change the trajectory, and it can do it either positively, well, stigma and discrimination obviously not. When they experience that, it changes it negatively. But addressing that and addressing those conditions and eliminating stigma and discrimination can change it in a way that's more positive. And you know, I'm a white English cisgendered heterosexual woman, so I do not come to this from a lived experience perspective. But there's a lot of people in my life that I love very much that are part of the 2S LGBTQ community. And when you talked about systemic inclusion and visibility, a trans friend of mine will say, my visibility is revolution. And it makes me think about the way public health is set up. You know, we sometimes say, okay, who do we need at the table? And so my question then is, who is not at the table, who is not visible, and why? And what conditions are preventing them from being there? And so thinking about Peggy's activism and advocacy piece, just visibility and providing space that is safe and welcoming and gives voice is a form of advocacy and is a form of system change. So anyway, I just thought was really thoughtful, and I hope what I've said makes sense, but thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you. Thank you.
So Karen, I'm going to ask you to come on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Peggy and Arne, for such amazing presentations, honestly. I'm going to follow up now. Can you see my screen now? Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so again, thank you for this opportunity to present to you today on a topic that is truly near and dear to my heart. That's been the focus really of my research for the past 2 decades, which is really on health equity for older immigrants and refugees. I'm going to focus today on immigrants. My team and I have done a number of recent papers on refugee health and older refugee health in particular, using the Canadian longitudinal study on aging data. But I'm not going to present that today, given the time constraints, but I'm happy to share those particular publications with you as well at the end. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank my co-author, Dr. Mashira Han, who was my PhD student, who is now working for the Mather Institute in the Chicago area. She's played a major role in the development of the chapter on which this presentation is based, and the presentation slides itself. So I'm privileged to be able to present to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. So there are 3, I guess they're not so much learning objectives as presentation objectives today. We were asked to think about learning objectives for the chapter in the book, but the objectives today are just this development of a recognition of the health status of older immigrants in Canada, and also to identify what are some of those salient challenges that really provide barriers to the uptake of health promotion practices among older immigrants. And the third is to think about, to identify and then critically analyze 2 promising practices for health promotion among Canadian older immigrants. And these, and it's here where I want to talk a little bit more about community engagement. So I'm going to emphasize the importance of meaningful community engagement in the development of programs and services for older immigrants, and also the research that we need to undertake and that we have undertaken in the last decade or so to explore the needs for and the efficacy of these programs and services. So why is this research work or the program and service development work, why is this important? Canada, and I'm going to sort of set this context here, Canada has the highest proportion of immigrants, or for what we would consider foreign-born citizens, among all of the G8 countries at almost, well, now it's over 22%. The statistics at the time were about 21.9%, but we're looking towards, in the next few years, 25%. And immigrants actually represent over 1/3 of the population 65 and over. So they're actually a larger proportion of the older adult population. The other important point to note that's not on the screen here is that over 70% of immigrants, or the foreign-born, are racialized or visible minority. And this is important to think about in the context of intersectionality that Peggy and Arne have so wonderfully discussed, have already presented and discussed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I move forward. Immigrant older adults also face significant and unique challenges that are posed by the social, the economic, geographical context, culture, and environmental exigencies that accompany the process of migration. And the fact is that we have to uncover these challenges through engaged work with communities. And I'll speak about that again, as I said, as I talk about the examples. And finally, policymakers and other key stakeholders, there's a need to address complex and intricate questions on older immigrant health. And despite these 2 points, they haven't adequately addressed, policymakers really haven't adequately addressed what I feel are the complex and intricate health issues of this growing population. So some of the questions that need to be asked are, what are the determinants of older immigrant health in particular? Secondly, what are the barriers to the uptake of health promotion among older immigrants? And then finally, how can we optimize this uptake of health promotion in this population? So what are some of the barriers or challenges to the uptake of health promoting practices in communities of older immigrants? Many of these particular barriers, they interact or they intersect to create even greater challenges. But the first is the process of migration itself. So actually moving from a familiar to an unfamiliar or a new environment or a new cultural context. The second is socioeconomic status, or what we refer to as class. And we know that a large proportion of older immigrants are unemployed, underemployed, or they're in precarious work situations, meaning that they're working without permits or contracts. And in my home province of British Columbia, there have been several cases that have been spotlighted or highlighted in the last decade, particularly in the South Asian community among older immigrant women, in this case of precarious employment. We have to acknowledge also that older immigrant women who migrate later in life take on the lion's share of childcare and housekeeping duties in their adult children's homes. So we have to start to think about how that intersects and how that, the obligation that older adults feel, particularly those that come in under family class immigration category, that particular class, how class or socioeconomic status actually impacts their health. The third is language proficiency and health literacy. And I think for both of these, what I want to say here, we know that language proficiency in charter languages of English and French have been an issue for older immigrants, particularly for racialized older immigrants. Health literacy also, interestingly, and Irv Rootman, of course, who's one of the co-editors of the book, has spoken about health literacy writ large, but has also talked about the fact that, and noted that immigrants actually have lower levels of health literacy than the Canadian born. The other point I want to make about, which is linked to this next challenge, is visible minority status or racialization. And as you recall, I said 70% of immigrants are in fact visible minority. They encounter greater levels of prejudice and discrimination. Certainly we know in public and workspaces, our research has shown this, which does create greater barriers to participation in health programs and services. Gender is also a very important barrier. And when we talk about gender, I'm particularly speaking about women in particular are more reticent to participate than men for reasons that are in programs and services that are related to health. And it's related to culture, modesty and propriety, gender roles and expectations, particularly of older women. Cultural perceptions around health and disease prevention, and we've spoken a little bit about this already, but examples include things like illness or decreased health status are inevitable. The sort of inevitability of illness or decreased health status in South Asian and East Asian communities, or on the contrary, so that can be a negative in actually seeking out sort of participation in or participating in health promotion programs. Or on the contrary, it can be seen as a sign, they say it could be seen as a sign from a higher power, from God, that individuals have to take better care of themselves. So then this might be an impetus for participation. So there's other ways of looking at this that are not necessarily all barriers or negative. Social connections, which have been noted already. Social connections that are related in particular to migration, the loss of social networks, key social networks in home country. in home countries and or places of birth, and the reticence due to language and cultural barriers to participate then in health promotion programs and access services. So what are some examples of promising, indeed, I think, really successful practices or programs that have been undertaken in immigrant communities? Well, Mishira and I found several, but these are two that really rose to the top in terms of their efficacy, meaning, the outcomes of these practices resulted in better physical health and better mental health. And I have to say that what really made us think that these programs should be spotlighted is that they're both programs that were developed through meaningful engagement with frontline workers and members of the community. So the older adults themselves and the family members. So the South Asian Exercise Trial, and those of you from BC may know about this already, is now known as the South Asian Exercise and Yoga Trial, which was the follow-up to the SIAT. Was actually the core researcher was Scott Lear at Simon Fraser University, who's done a lot of work on cardiovascular health in the South Asian immigrant community. It was a 12-week randomized trial, and it was really testing the efficacy of cardiovascular exercise on the distribution of body fat in postmenopausal South Asian women. So the women themselves were largely, they're being recruited from, this took place in Surrey, BC, which to those of you who are knowledgeable about, around the Lower Mainland, the demographic profile of the Lower Mainland, so that Surrey is home to one of the largest populations of South Asians in the country. Similarly, it would be similar to Ontario, Brampton in Ontario. So what they found was that visceral adipose tissue was actually significantly reduced among women who adhered to the program, and that there was an improvement in sense of well-being. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that program actually looked like, or what it was, and what are some of the elements of best practice in this case. So one, the program itself took place at a community center in a largely South Asian subdivision in BC, so in Surrey. So the proximity to the actual program itself was very close. In terms of cultural, it was also culturally appropriate. And here, I didn't say much about what the program itself was. It centered on, and this was after much consultation with, again, frontline workers, community members, the older adults themselves and the family members. It focused on the use of a Bhangra dance program that was conducted in South Asian, in different dialects at this community center program. And so this was familiar music, it was familiar dance or activity. The third element of best practice in this case was that it was on-site health promotion that occurred alongside the exercise program. So while these older immigrant women were actually participating in the exercise program or the dance program, they were also being, there was information, there were lectures on other sort of health promoting practices around nutrition, around other forms of physical activity. So these were really interesting elements that in the end played a significant role, I think, in the efficacy on how effective the program actually was in improving the physical health of older immigrant South Asian women. The second program was one that took place in East Vancouver, and it was launched by or supported by Mosaic, which was one of the largest multicultural service organizations in the Lower Mainland. And it was called Creating a Sense of Belonging, Mental Health Promotion within Immigrant and Refugee Communities. It was a 2-year program, and it worked to train what were known as CCHPs, or cross-cultural health promoters, these were trained social workers or social workers in training, or those who were already or healthcare professionals in countries of origin of the participating older adults themselves. So they were from congruent language and cultural communities. There were two components, and one was a social support aspect or dimension. So there were social support groups, and there were also community capacity building activities that were worked into or integrated into the actual program itself that ran for the 2 years. An example of this, an example of a social support group was the Afghan Women's Social Circle, which again, in terms of geographic proximity, was located in a particular community where there were a large, population of Afghanis, and that was in the area of the city of Burnaby. Other elements of best practice in creating this particular program were that the program itself was targeted and tailored to the needs of older adults and their family members. And it was on the ground, and it was slow and small. So there was rapport building through the CCHPs over time. It created an environment where respectful dialogue on mental health could be pursued. And these were other difficult subjects could be broached. And this was successful in that trained professionals, the CCHPs, were able to facilitate this. It also served to develop social networks among the women. This was the collaborative and community capacity building elements, so that long after the program ended, the social networks among the women persisted. So what did we really learn from a review of all of these wonderful health promotion programs? So these are some of the themes. What did researchers learn from these? And what did we hear from frontline workers and participants and families? So some of the emergent themes are that, and I've addressed, meaning the issues of inequity as well as inequality, innovation, social marketing approaches that communities used to actually develop these particular programs. And the social marketing approaches included using social media platforms, right, that were just emerging, but also recognizing that news programs, so visual, the television programs, but also radio programs were very important, as well as news media were important to venues in which to market, or modes of marketing. To develop public service announcements, frontline workers told us about public service announcements being really important and getting them out to community through newspapers, but also not only newspapers, but also radio and television. The building capacity of healthcare providers. So the training of culturally, I don't like to say competent, culturally empathetic workers, healthcare providers, workers, frontline workers, presenting the programs and services in culturally appropriate and simplified language and different modes for content, as I talked about, audio and visual presentations. Accelerating recredentialization. What's related to this sort of training piece is accelerating recredentialization processes for immigrant healthcare professionals. And this was absolutely central to the success, I think, of the CCHP program, the mental health program, where we would have seen even more programs being developed across the city if we had been able to utilize the well-credentialed professionals who were waiting for recredentialization in their immigrant communities. So thank you, and I certainly want to say thank you to all of the older immigrants and their family members who participated in our studies, but also thank you to all of the frontline workers who we've been working with very closely. When we talk about meaningful community engagement,
this doesn't mean just coming in at the end and asking, did this work well? It means the importance of engagement really means that it's a process from well before the project is actually funded. So in other words, in developing the grant proposal itself for funding, we need to engage meaningfully. In other words, bring on community members as co-researchers in the development of the proposal itself. And that's something that my team certainly has been committed to over the years. It's an important part of successful knowledge mobilization. We know this, or what we now term, what we think about as implementation science, how these particular outcomes get taken up in the end. And Arne has this wonderful report coming out. That's one way. Certainly we need to get reports out to service providers in ethnocultural communities, but we also need to make sure that these particular outcomes or these particular reports are available in a wide variety of accessible media. So thank you. Yes, and thank you to the audience today for participating, and to my co-presenters and to the organizers.
Thanks, Karen. That was really amazing. And again, same with when I was listening to Arne, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, you know, there's so much more in that, and hearing you describe it than just appears on the slides, right? And that context is really important. What you just said about bringing folks in, you know, not just asking them at the end how they perceive something, you know, and it makes me think about evaluation in my many years in frontline public health, and how at the end of a program or the end of an initiative, we would ask people, do a satisfaction survey, or we would ask them about what they thought of something, which is a form of engagement, but it's a really late stage and very surface level form of engagement. And what we're talking about, I think what you're talking about here is, you know, how do we bring them in at the beginning of to actually inform the development, or to inform the decisions, or inform what actually is there for them. So again, similar to my thinking around evaluation, don't think of it after something's done. We need to build it into the whole creation, the whole process of structuring whatever it is that we're creating for older adults, whether it's housing, whether it's income supports, whether it's exercise programs, whatever it is. We should take the lead from the people that we're trying to reach. And I was also thinking, when you were speaking about the barriers to uptake of health promotion status, and, you know, recognizing that, I know this is what you meant, but those barriers are beyond just an individual deciding whether they do or do not want to attend, you know, a program, or whether they're motivated, or, you know, I think of all those really typical individual lifestyle common things that we hear, and as practitioners that we commonly go to when we're trying to think of what are the barriers, right? The barriers are systemic. The barriers are in our communities. The barriers often have to do with how people feel they don't have a place to engage. And so, you know, those barriers to uptake of health promotion are, you know, what are the barriers that we as service providers are putting into place, right? That might be preventing people. And I also just want to mention, you talked about that intersection of working conditions with health of immigrant older adults. And my colleague and friend, Carolina Jimenez, who's online, has just done is deep in some work on decent work and working conditions as a determinant of health, is part of the Decent Work Coalition. I think I might be getting that wrong, Carolina, if you've got a better link or an accurate title. And of course, some of that relates to older adults as well. So flagging that there's lots of intersections. So thank you a lot for what you just said. So I'll ask, Arne's back on. Yeah, Irv's here. Peggy, are you back on? I can't quite see you on the other.
I'm here.
My screen was just situating. So, you know, we have a couple of questions that we thought we might pose, but I do actually see that someone has their hand up. I think Indu, you have your hand up. And certainly if people want to verbalize a question, that would be fine, I think. So Indu, do you want to unmute and go ahead?
Yes. My question is, I'm a medical doctor and I've been working with the immigrant population for years. What I find is sometimes in health promotion, we write the message, but it doesn't resonate with the population because either their words are not mean anything to them or anything. And I worked with First Nation and Inuit too. And when we were looking at the cancer, they didn't have a word for cancer. And I've always talked to the elders because they have a knowledge base, and same is for the immigrant community. So I am just saying, when we do any health promotion or any message, we need to first look at their elders and ask them how it resonates with them. Because otherwise we have done a lot of work, but it doesn't resonate with them and they don't have. The second thing which I have learned over the years is that within each culture, there is a health promotion done, but in their own way, not in what we do with the research. And we need to learn those so that when we present anything, it is for everyone. So I just wanted to, and thank you very much, Karen, because I like to know more what you have done, your study, and also Peggy's book, so that we can then pass on message in a relevant way to South Asian community, which I'm quite involved with.
Thank you so much, Indu. I love to, the fact that you're a medical practitioner, a healthcare practitioner is wonderful, and that you are actually a frontline. You're one of the key frontline workers who we've been interacting with in our own work. I think the 2 points that you made, and I'm sorry, we didn't really have a lot of time to cover everything, but in Irv and Peggy's book, in the Promoting the Health of Older Adults book, in our chapter, we speak to those 2 points that you just made. The importance of language, so that not just doing literal translations of health promotion materials, which requires, as you said, interactions, meaningful interactions with older adults or elders in communities and their family members. Does this make sense to you? We can't just literally translate promotional material that has been developed for Western sort of communities, when we think about this, or Canadian-born communities. And the other piece that you were talking about with regards to meaningful interactions with elders is actually that's key to the process for us, is that we engage early on with older adults, and even developing, when I said research, but I also mean in community development work for programs and services. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to continue this conversation with you after this particular webinar. So
thank you.
Email me.
Thank you, Indu and Karen. Would anyone else like to verbally pose a question? If you do, put your hand up and we can unmute the line. But I wondered if, Arne had any comments, similar to the points that Karen and Indu were talking about with immigrant older adults, or how to address some of those same things among the 2S LGBTQ community of older adults. And then I see Shabina's hand, so go ahead.
I'll just quickly say, I think identifying and visibilizing community champions who can really be a face and represent members of these communities is so important, right? We want to see ourselves in these health promotion initiatives and know that that's for us as well. So I think that's one of the things that we can do to reach members of these communities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Shabina, you've got your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? And if you're talking, you're muted. We can't hear.
Oh, sorry. So sorry. Hi, folks. Thank you for such an amazing webinar. I just wanted to go back to Indu's point regarding language support as well, because what a lot of times is ignored, or actually pretty much all the time is ignored, are the spoken languages. There are so many survival languages. These are like because folks have been displaced due to colonization, and so there are so many survival languages. And when we look at the healthcare system, I know they are kind of mandated to provide language support, but they always look at what region you're from or what continent you're from, and then they just give the top couple language support, and folks don't really quite understand when it comes to their health well-being. So if I would love for everybody to advocate for spoken language support, not just the language, because there are languages that have no written form. It's just strictly spoken, and they are survival languages with so many different dialects and other languages mixed in there. The other point I wanted to point out right now is because of our economy and the how the system is set up. When we look at older adult abuse and neglect, our system is #1 in abusing and neglecting our older adult population. The way system is set up is not catered to the needs, and definitely not thought through intersectional lens. Yeah, those are my, I just wanted to put that out there.
Diane, could I respond to that?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Shavina. Those are excellent points, just as Indu's points were excellent points that were made with regards to, the work that you're doing in immigrant communities, and that's steeped in your experiences. So I really appreciate that. The first point you made around language support for what, for communities where there are, where there isn't support. In other words, dialects that aren't, you're right, not #1 or #2, like Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi. There are, our team has been advocating, campaigning for more person-centered approaches, certainly participant-centered approaches to the development of programs and services. And it costs money, certainly. What we're finding is that it often falls onto family members to come in as interpreters and translators. Again, this is part of sort of a more neoliberal agenda that loads responsibility for care, social and health care, onto families. We need to do a better job. Absolutely. There need to be resources that are put into the development of language support, just as much as there is, when we talk about the development, because what is happening is that the programs that are developed are quite standardized. And we know that the needs, the issues that are emerging in immigrant communities don't fit this standardization. We need to change the model, and we need to change, when I talk about the model, that includes the funding model for this kind of work. We need to recognize that much of the work, important work that's being done, is being done by family members right now. The elder abuse piece that you talked about is also a really important, oftentimes stigmatized, topic in racialized or visible minority immigrant communities. I'm just going to refer you to my email again, because I myself and in collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Elder Law had a project funded by the Council to Reduce Elder Abuse in British Columbia. And we look specifically at the issue of elder abuse in Chinese and South Asian communities. And so I'm just please get in touch with me, and I'll talk to you about some of the findings from that. But you're absolutely right. It's an under-examined, under-reported issue, and there are many reasons for it that are what we would structurally grounded.
Nice, Karen. And Karen Serwanka, you've got your hand up, I think.
When I think of determinants of health and how this has an impact on us as we age, I remember a positive example from my personal life. And for a couple of decades, I lived in Toronto in cooperative housing. And I think cooperative housing provided a very interesting experience. I saw a lot of leadership come from seniors who had probably spent a couple of decades in the co-op themselves, raising their children, and moved on to a different stage of life, contributed immensely both to the families that lived in cooperative housing, but also in the surrounding neighborhoods. The people were very active, and I don't mean just active physically, which they were, and it was a very walkable community, so that was very positive. But they were also active in the board of the co-op. And I think, you know, when we think of housing, we think of shelter and affordability and all of those kinds of things, which are super important. But I think co-op housing also provides the opportunity for people to contribute to the decisions that impact their lives. And I would just like to ask if any of the speakers have had experience in housing more generally or in cooperative housing more specifically. So it's an experience I bring from my personal life, but I find it a very positive health promoting opportunity that I don't hear talked about a lot. So thank you very much for everyone who's contributed today. It's very interesting.
Thanks, Karen. Peggy, you're waving your actual hand. Do you want to?
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for raising that point. I work with the Council on Aging in Ottawa, and I'm actually the co-chair of the Age-Friendly Housing Committee. So this is something that we've been looking at, and as are many other groups across the country, but you're dead on. You know, and we need more innovative forms of housing. Older adults want that, community-based. The cooperative example you gave, co-living is another one. And there's home sharing. You know, we've got some great examples of older adults living in big houses with empty bedrooms, home sharing with young people. And, you know, in exchange for a little bit of a lower rent, the young people are helping with the technology, they're shoveling the snow, whatever. But the whole focus community. And the other area I'd like to mention that I think is really important in Canada is this growth in intergenerational living. Although it's still a small number, it's the fastest growing form of housing. And it's largely driven by the immigrant refugee community and our Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities. They are more likely to live in intergenerational housing. But we don't build houses. We don't allow people to modify their houses to encourage that. And there are wonderful models in Japan and China and other places that we should be looking at and encouraging. So thanks for bringing up the housing issue. It's absolutely critical to engagement.
Karen and Arne, did you want to add to that at all?
I think it's such a good point, and I'm reminded of one of our spotlight communities in Palm Springs. There was a continuum of care called Stonewall Gardens that was established from the ground up, and this houses LGBT older folks with diverse care needs, and it's just a really, really exciting practice. I'm connected with and aware of folks in the Ottawa Senior Pride Network, and I know there is a housing subcommittee, and that's one of the things that they're looking at too, is how can we age together collectively as queer people. So it's a really good point, and I think there will be some innovative models that bubble up in the near future.
I just plugged the link to Stonewall Gardens in there. I've not heard of it, so yeah, that's very, very cool. Karen, did you want to add in?
And I'll just link to what Peggy was saying about, the reality is that intergenerational households are more likely to be in immigrant communities, or that this is a type of housing that immigrant older adults are living in, these housing situations. Intergenerational housing in these cases are largely due to it's for economic reasons. There's been some really good work done in the United States on this. And I'm sure, Peggy, you also referred to Indigenous communities. This is the same reality, but it's also due to, for cultural reasons, right? It's that the oldest sons, or more recently, older daughters now who are talking to us for different projects, are saying that it's expected, it's an obligation, it's part of their particular obligation to care, part of filial piety, filial obligation. And sometimes, so we look at intergenerational living or housing as an important topic when we come to communities to talk to them about health and social care. I think social housing in Victoria, for example, there are more and more new models being developed in collaboration. Karen, you were saying, in collaboration with boards of directors who are, 50% are made up of older adults now who are living precariously. And there's a society in Victoria called Kool-Aid, and my friend is the controller for that, a very good friend of mine. And she's talking about the newest development going up, which is intergenerational in nature. So there will be a daycare there. There will be an older adult or a seniors activity center there. There will be a clinic, not only a healthcare clinic, but a dental clinic on site. And this actually coincides quite nicely with the announcement that hopefully will be made around universal dental care in the future. Certainly it's been bandied around in the last couple of days. So absolutely, Karen, I agree that, and more organizations are recognizing, housing organizations that I know of anyway in the city, in the Lower Mainland and in Victoria, recognizing the importance of hearing. When I say hearing, developing meaningful kind of engagement with older adults that involves having them on their board, having them in decision-making roles. So thank you.
Those are perfect examples of really tangible things that public health promotion, other organizations can do, right? Is bringing older adults into those decision-making processes where there's an opportunity for real influence. So I'll follow up with one quick question that was in the chat box, but I'll ask for quick responses because we're now running out of time. But someone, in follow-up to the housing pieces, anyone aware of information around equity and long-term care congregate setting residents? Certainly if any of our participants out there can suggest websites or articles, plunk them in the chat box. But do any of our speakers have anything to offer specifically around that? I am aware, and then I'll stop talking. There's a researcher at Dalhousie University here in Nova Scotia called Jackie Gahagan, and I believe that she has recently done some work. Certainly she's done a lot of work around seniors in the 2S LGBTQ community, but I believe some recently was specifically around long-term care. So I'll look for a few links on that. But Peggy, Karen, Arne?
Just really quickly, we know that some of the local senior pride networks in Ontario do training for long-term care to provide more inclusive and culturally safer environments for queer folks. There's also some training materials available through Ontario Centres for Learning, Research and Innovation in Long-Term Care, CLRI. They've done a nice toolkit. And then I was also involved in some work that was done by Virtual Hospice to promote equity for LGBTQ2 folks as well.
Nice. And someone's just noting in the chat box at Jackie Gahagan is now at Mount St. Vincent, and I've forgotten about that. But thanks, Arne. And if you've got any links for any of that you could share, just send them to me and I can include them in the follow-up. I'll pause just for a second to see if anyone else wants to chime in. But Karen,
I'll just do one thing, a resource, CanAge, which is the Canadian Seniors Advocacy Network, which is led by the wonderful Laura Tamblyn-Watts, who's a very good friend of mine. She's also a former director, that head of the Canadian Centre for Elder Law. But CanAge has some great resources as well, and they are particularly over the course of the pandemic, been developing resources on long-term care. So there's a wealth of information there, and I'm one of their advisors. So I think in terms of resources, please check out their website.
Nice. That's great. Thanks, Karen. And I think we're just about at time. The one thing that I haven't announced is the winner of the door prize of the free book. So the way I do this is I just sort of, I randomize the names and I pick one, and I actually picked Indu Gambier, who's right. You'll receive a copy of our book.
Thank you.
So we'll be in touch to arrange to get that to you from the publisher. So I just...
Yeah, can I make a quick comment?
Oh gosh, I was actually just going to say, I want to ask her to chime in. So yes.
Well, I've been in health promotion since 1978 when it started, including 15 years in retirement. And I'm really encouraged by this, the webinar and the people that are now in health promotion. For a while, I was worrying about the future of health promotion, but I'm starting to see that it's got a great future. There's a lot of work that's now being recognized that's going on in health promotion and in a variety of fields across the spectrum. So I just want to end on a positive note that I'm very optimistic for the future, but I also, and I'd like to thank Diane for such a good, being such a good host again, and Arne, Peggy, and Karen for fantastic presentations, and the audience for contributing to this webinar. So I guess that's that's about all I have to say at this point.
That's great. Thanks, sir. You know, the future is bright, in large part because you have built a really solid foundation for things to grow from. So thank you. And with that, I will close. If our speakers can stay on a minute to have a chat, that's great. If not, that's also fine. We'll be in touch with the evaluation link and some resources. And I also just want to thank our translators and our closed captioners in the background who've done amazing work. So thank you very much, everyone. And keep the suggestions coming.